Okay, so welcome back, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this keynote speech at the fourth Populism Specialist Group workshop. And we're very happy to have you all here. And most of all, we're very happy to have Simon Tormey with us, who is going to give our second keynote. So Simon is a professor at the University of Bristol, where he's not only professor, he's also Dean of Faculty of Social Sciences and Law, which, as he has said, is an excellent position to be having in these times. And his research interests are spanning quite a wide field, I would say, across political theory, European politics, and also social critique. And I think which is obviously relevant to all of us here, and which is why we're so happy to have him with us today. So Simon has published many books and articles, and I don't have time to list them all in this format. But just recently, over the past few years, he has published three quite things that I think we should all read, which is first, Populism, A Beginner's Guide, which is this little fella here, which I think is a very useful overview to sort of map out some of the main debates that we have been having here as well. It's also published a book on reconfiguring democracy, the Spanish political laboratory, which is on all the interesting things that have happened in Spain over the past 10 years or so. And also a couple of years back, he published The End of Representative Politics. So as you say, so wealth of knowledge to draw on here. So Simon will now present to us Temporalities of Populism or towards the sociology of population. So we have around an hour and 15 minutes in total, and we'll hopefully have some time for questions at the end. So Simon, please go ahead.
Thank you, Emmy. Thank you, Andy, for inviting me to do the keynote. It's a great honor to present at this conference. Last year's conference was outstanding in every way, and I've still got very fond memories of the sessions, very high quality, and there are many friends out there on the right-hand side. I hope you'll still be friends with me in an hour and a quarter. There's going to be a few exchanges, I suspect. I do want to just say a couple of things before getting into things. I mean, first of all, congratulations to Carola. Our dirty secret is I was one of the PhD examiners. So I had that piece of congratulations up my sleeve. But of course, that's a great fillip for all our PhD and ECRs out there as well, to know that it is actually possible to pass a PhD, even with the likes of myself examining it. So well done, Carola. And also just to say to people, these are really difficult times, and I admire the desire to want to carry on with conferences, even in a virtual format, and just listening to the quality of the discourse in the last session there. My brain has kind of turned to sort of sludge over the last 6 months, and part of that is, of course, administrative, but it's also it's very anxious making times, and particularly anxious making for young scholars and for people in sort of precarious employment. I'm very mindful of that. So I award yourself all a big sort of hug from me, even though we're not physically present, but we're very conscious that these are difficult times, and trying to maintain that kind of scholarly outlook and mentality, very important for us, but also quite difficult. I personally have found it very difficult to read academic work over the last few months, and also to really try to focus on saying something interesting and challenging and so on. But I didn't want to turn down the invitation. That's the kind of the dishonest and cowardly thing to do. But to kind of have that churning away, that invite, and that kind of sense of wanting to say something and do something has been a good support for me as well. Because otherwise, you just get stuck in spreadsheets and strategy documents and all the rest of it. But it's actually been really great to have a kind of endpoint to trying to bring together some thoughts, precipitated in part by some conversations I had with members of the group when we met Marina and Gorgos some while ago. It seems like about 5 years ago, but it's probably only, when was it? Sort of January time when we were having a book launch in London, Loughborough. And I was kind of saying to myself, one of the things that we need to start thinking about in populism studies is a kind of sociological issues, and trying to put together not only the sort of case type issues that we've been speaking about, political science type literatures, but also thinking more broadly about modernization and how all the sort of bits and bones fit together into a kind of sociology of populism. And then the other thing was, of course, Andy and Emmy wanted this edition of the populism studies to go with this idea of temporalities as well. So the idea of, how do we think about space and time in connection to populism? So I've tried to sort of put all these things together. I'm not presenting any empirical material. There are no findings here. It's a concepts paper. It's a very sprawling paper. It's really an invite. So people, it's an invite to a discussion, really. I'm not coming at this with a very sort of closed, narrow, kind of defensive style of presentation here. Far from it. I think what I'd like is kind of, to be quizzed and challenged and pushed on some of these things that I think we could be saying about populism, but we'll see how we go. It's not a whiz-bang technological, pictorial, visual presentation. It's thinking on paper. There are about 8 slides in total. And Emmy's asked me if I could finish by about 1:45. So that's what I intend to do and see what people think. Now, having said that, I can't get the first slide to move across. Here I can. So, sprawling presentation, no dramatics here, no pictures, just questions and pointers and a hypothesis, if you like. And these are the kind of questions that I'm thinking about in relation to this presentation. In connection with Emmy and Andy's conference topic here, how should we think about populism's temporality? And when we're thinking about temporalities, of course, we also then think, I can just pick up a little bit of background. I don't know if anyone is asking me a question or not, but I'll carry on until I see a little hand going. Or it's ontology, and not to get too obfuscatory here or kind of eccentric in design, but some of those discussions that we had in the last session and perhaps earlier sessions, and apologies that I wasn't able to make the previous days, but is about populism and ontology, about what it is that we are actually pointing to when we think about populism. Is populism just a kind of regime, another type we discuss in comparative mode? And I think for a large portion of its history in scholarly circles, populism has had that connotation. It's as we know from the 1960s onwards, it's really been a kind of story of how comparative politics scholars, people like Cass Mudder, obviously, but thinking about that very early volume, 1967, I think it was, about populism with the colleagues from the LSC and Ken Minogue and so on. We had that discussion really, which was about types and about types of regime, types of political system. But we know that, and of course, there are many people attending who are not from that kind of comparative background, but rather from a kind of political theory, discourse analysis background. And for them, maybe populism is more about a strategy, following the lead in particular of an Esther Leclau and Chantal Mouffe. And if it's a strategy, then its ontology is kind of slightly different, isn't it? It's much more about a regime to come, a potential, perhaps a comportment or a way of doing politics. So when we think about the bullet 2 and 3 here, I was kind of thinking in that last session, a lot of the kind of crankiness and the creakiness about populism and how it's been used and how it's been incorporated and how it's been overcoded with particular issues is partly in relation to this, isn't it? We haven't really got a kind of settled sense. And I'm using a very royal we here, not just those of us in the sort of populism studies genre, but journalists. And I was reading Simon Cooper's article in the Financial Times from last weekend, yesterday, about his view of populism, Trump, Johnson, etc. And a lot of us get irritated when we hear Trump and Johnson being connected to populism, but journalists have another kind of use for the term, as we've been hearing from Aurelien, amongst others. And what do we think of the explosion of populism? Populism as a disruptive event. So to put in another kind of ontological claim there, a kind of Badiouian take on things would be that populism represents a kind of, an eruption, a disruption to how we do politics, how we think about politics. It's a moment, but it's a moment between what then? Are we expecting the reversion to normality? And that's the thing which really I kind of motivates me to write in this particular vein. I kind of don't think that. I don't think of populism as being a sort of disruptive moment or event between the kind of, you know, business as usual style of politics. I think something deeper is going on, something more, and that's why I'm interested in the sort of sociology of this. So the kind of the ultimate orientating question is really, is modernity producing the conditions for more of these events? Is there a tendency towards populism, which I'm using this very ungainly term here, populization? If we're thinking about populization as a kind of process, as a sort of unfolding of particular trends and tendencies. And that's really the kind of provocation that I'd like to explore today. So a little bit about an initial hypothesis. You notice I'm couching things in terribly kind of unsubstantiated ways. That's the point. It's to really, it's to kind of bring you a buffet of things and then see what you think, because lots of people out where you're all in populism studies, I'm really keen to get your kind of sensations back about what you're thinking. Some of our answers are a matter of genre. Political scientists like regime system types, as we know. Sociologists like them less. I'm more of a sociologist, or more sociologically minded, as it were. Whereas some of my colleagues, Pippa Norris, of course, great friend and colleague during my time at Sydney, very much types. You know, you move from one type to another, you've got tick boxes, and once you've accumulated a certain number of ticks in a box, we can call it populist or not populist or democratic and so on. And I'm using that sort of concept of genre a bit like, we'll hear a bit more from Jean-François Lyotard later on, but it's that kind of, when we're thinking about different ways of trying to describe things with different terms. And again, I kind of think that's part of our, that's part of what makes populism a fascinating term, but also induces this deep sense of annoyance and irritation, which I heard in the last session there about somebody's using the term in the wrong way. And I think that's what led to Andy's question about, you know, are we in a sense trying to impose or dictate or ignore common language uses of terms? I mean, I agree both with Andy and Aurélien, actually. I think paying attention to discourse is, of course, really important, but we can't ignore the fact that there are kind of just, you know, sort of common sense understandings of terms out there as well. And if we try to overcode them or to deny them or whatever, then we're going to sort of, you know, end up in sort of an Alice in Wonderland situation where we're trying to impose meanings on terms or to be very kind of fixed in the way in which we use them. So genre, that's a kind of capacious way of saying, where, you know, depending on what kinds of things we're trying to use terms for, we might find that we've got a lot of kind of conceptual slippage or definitional slippage between one genre and another. Those of us of a sociological bent should be attuned to the interconnections of processes, institutions, and the cultures being produced. At this level of analysis, populism as an uncoupling, and that's the kind of, you know, a bit of a master concept for me in this presentation. Henrik Bang's work, I think, is quite useful for us in this respect. That, you know, the kind of the big story, the big picture story that I was trying to paint in the end of representative politics was about really the decline of representation, the decline of the typical traditional liberal representative ways of doing things, really since the 1960s. And we can look at the data a little bit later on. Haven't got tables or anything like that, but just in a kind of descriptive mode. But an uncoupling, a sense that we don't really want to be represented, or if we do want to be represented, then we want to be represented by those who don't like representation or who want representation to work in different ways to the inherited ways of liberal democratic representation. That kind of thing we'll talk about quite a lot more. Legitimation crises. So we have a lot of crises going on. Obviously, we've got kind of COVID. We've got the Brexit crisis, of course, here in the UK. We talk a lot about the crisis of democracy. And of course, if you're of a kind of neo-Marxist bent, then you tend to talk about crisis just like you're going to buy a loaf of bread. We have capitalist crisis. We have crisis of our culture. You know, crisis prone. It's crisis, 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 crisis. Then we've got hypermediatization. That's a topic we'll come back to as well. The kind of ways in which the media alters our perception of who we are, what kind of subjects we are, what the object of being a subject is. Anxiety, I was reading in The Guardian this morning, you know, big sort of, we're just much more anxious than we were. That's got to be factored into our thinking about what's going on, more of that. Social anomie and alienation, those are kind of more old-fashioned terms, as we know in sociology, but are we feeling anxious? Are we feeling stressed? We are a little bit, aren't we, colleagues? And it's not just COVID. I mean, we've, you know, climate crisis, the environment, precarious labor, automation, you know, you name it, everything seems to be lining up. Last night, as a kind of remedy for that, I went to Spotify and I put on unwind 60s music. I recommend that. It was a very optimistic time, the 60s. I mean, it's not a time without strife and antagonism and civil, you know, conflicts and so. Of course it was, but you know, you listen to those lyrics, you go, wow, that really feels like centuries and centuries ago. I was alive in the 60s, you guys weren't, but you know, has there not been a kind of gestalt shift? And what causes that gestalt shift for us? And this means more populism and hence popularization. Does it not? That's the provocation to us really in this presentation. Are we not seeing these kind of macro sociological changes, which I think are feeding through into our politics? See what you think. Okay. Situating populism, well, we're all populists together and you're all experts. So this is my one and only slide here, just to remind us, if you know, that there are a lot of definitions, but some things are common to those definitions. So it's not unanchored. It's not that I don't think that populism is essentially contested in the same way that we talk about a concept like liberty or equality as being essentially contested. Some of you might disagree with that, because I think there are sort of commonalities and sort of common ways of thinking about that. But I don't need to go beyond those commonalities. I don't need to produce a sort of pure, neat definition of a kind which is going to help me unpack in sort of analytic mode what I want to do. What I just want here is kind of list of reminders. Elites and people features in nearly everyone's definition of populism. The idea of populism as in some sense a disruption to ordinary politics or normal politics or the ordinary ways in which we do things. I think that's, you know, pretty common even to those who are advocating, you know, left populist position, or we must be more populist. It's still in the way of saying that just going through the regular motions of centre-left or leftish politics is not good enough. We need to add something to that mix. We need to precipitate, if you like, a crisis, which then will get us the desired effect. So even sort of normatively attached people still kind of share this sort of this account, of course. If you're not normatively attached to a left populist position, then all of this sounds a bit scary, doesn't it? And this is the FT, the Economist, the things that Aurélien was talking about in the last session, that, you know, in a sense, the disruptive, abnormal, crisis, these are kind of sticks with which to beat those who've got a more sort of positive view. But we're still within a context where what we're describing is sort of common to us all. The idea of condensation, of course, straight out of Laclau, the idea of simplifying politics, condensing politics, making politics more intelligible, more effective, reaching to our emotions, using slogans, shorthands, those kind of things, of course, again, common to our thinking about what differentiates. There are not that many people out there who kind of want to couple populism and techno-politics or technocratic modes. Ben Moffat and I, you know, those, you know, that kind of piece in political studies, we were kind of thinking about a spectrum. And we tended to think about technologically driven politics, highly complex politics as being down one end, and then populism as being this kind of more condensing, effective, emotional, simplifying politics. Does anybody really disagree with that? I don't know, maybe we'll find out. And then I wrote this book called, of course, The End of Representative Politics, which happened just before, which I wrote in 2013, of course, just before this kind of great upsurge of things, which then everybody leapt on. I think I might have, you know, sort of used, instead of post-representation, played around with the concept of hyper-representation, because I think there is something in populism which, of course, remains very resolutely within the representative paradigm. So I'm kind of wrong at one level, aren't I, in saying, you know, representative politics is gone, or it's under stress to the extent that we no longer want to be represented. On the other hand, we might say actually it works the other way around, that it's the inherited traditions of representation, that sort of rather aristocratic or kind of mid-19th century view of representation, the J.S. Mill view of representation, that we're rebelling against. But actually, we still want to be represented, but it's in a very unique way, isn't it? We, the unrepresented, need to be represented by you in our quest to be represented. So we were kind of dissatisfied with the mode and structure of representation, but we're still looking for someone to represent us in that mode of dissatisfaction. That's really what I'm getting at here in this otherwise rather, excuse me for this kind of ungainly language and neologisms and so on. But you see, I'm just kind of, Emmy's smiling anyway, everyone else is grimacing, but I'm keeping an eye on you, you notice that. But I like, conceptual neologisms and innovations and so on. Some of them fall by the wayside, others get picked up and so on. That's part of our task as theorists, isn't it? Okay. So how do we represent this as populism bouillon as a process? And Salomé is out there as a fellow French speaker. There may be others out there. The concept of bouillon came to mind. I was in France last week. Bouillon is a kind of, there's sort of not a, it's a kind of soupy mixture, really. And that's what I'm not trying to give you a very kind of clean analytic sense of populism here. I'm talking about a bouillon, a kind of massive concepts that we are using in our work on populism and our understanding of populism. How do we think about it as a process? So how do we think of it less as a set of cases, a sort of tick box comparative politics type exercise, and less as a kind of Badiouian sort of event, ontological disruption to the normality, and more as a kind of an unfolding, as a process, as something which has taken us from somewhere and we're on this kind of journey to somewhere. So this is where I'm sort of, I'm looking to you guys really to sort of come back at me with this ugly. I will not pretend it's a pretty neologism, popularization. I'm happy to work on that and throw it out maybe and replace it with something else. But you guys are the experts, and you can see what I'm trying to do here. I'm trying to think about something which is situated in modernization processes, which is going to get us thinking about whether we are seeing trends and tendencies, and if we are, what do we do about that? Are they reversible, and so on? We'll come back to that at the end. And I've got 4 themes here, four slides, 4 themes. This is what's on my mind. The first one is that, you could think about this as a sort of master slide. I think if I'm wrong here, then we're probably going to find that the next 3 slides don't appeal. So, those of you who are kind of flicking in and out of the presentation, a bit like I do at sort of university management team meetings, have a think about this for the next 2 or 3 minutes, and then you can flick off a little bit and get on with looking at, I don't know, Tour de France has started yet or anything like that. From ideology to culpability. So I'm running with Lyotard's idea here. Lyotard and the Postmodern Conditions, quite a very old book now, 1984, describes the sort of contemporary condition, postmodern condition, as an incredulity towards meta-narratives. So that's really the kind of way in which he kind of signifies that we're not really ideological thinkers anymore. We're not believers in some redemptive story of emancipation. We don't believe that modernity has a kind of inbuilt or a sort of DNA which is leading us to an emancipatory future. And of course, he's thinking about Marxism as the kind of master meta-narrative coming out of the 60s and 70s and so on, and that kind of few people seem to really think that capitalism in particular is kind of auto-propelling us towards a moment of break, which would then usher in, we have a moment at socialism or barbarism, as Luxemburg puts it, but that in a sense it's inscribed in the DNA of modernity that unless we fall off the precipice completely and fall into barbarism, then the next stage is socialism, communism, and so on. We don't really have that belief anymore. We've become, as Lyotard puts it, kind of pagans, unbelievers. We're skeptics about people peddling stories of how all of this is going to unfold in a very positive direction. And in its place, really, I mean, Lyotard doesn't say this, but of course, we need to sort of think about, well, what are we becoming? A rise of a politics of injury Specific injustices, of course. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, Marina's got the Black Lives Matters in the background. We've had presentations about the Gilets jaunes, for example, the general ressentiment, if you like. Occupy, I think, is very much in this genre. These aren't redemptive, emancipatory narratives. They are stories about wrongs which have happened, which continue to persist, which need to be overcome. They're also, in organizational terms, and those of you who kind of follow my work a little bit will know I've done quite a lot of work on this since the sort of anti-capitalist, anti-globalization movements in the late 1990s. What comes through very kind of quite strongly during this period is a sort of anathema towards programs and manifestos which are considered to be kind of exclusionary. So, and of course, the language that we were using maybe 15 years ago, vertical versus non-programmatic horizontal politics. But of course, you know, that's very much in the spirit of the age. You know, we don't really want anything declaratory. We don't want spokespeople. We don't want representatives of these kind of things. So we've kind of inaugurated a different style, a different mode of politics, not only in terms of substantive outcomes, but also in terms of how we do politics. And I'm thinking there, of course, 15M as well, one of the more recent sort of empirical things that I've studied at close hand, a kind of sense in which people did not want to be beholden to either the kind of written word, to the program, or to particular figures. And even the emergence of Podemos, which of course was kind of greeted with, you know, some celebration parts of the left, but there are lots part of the left, as we know in Spain. This is all media politics, celebrity politics. It's all about building up, you know, the figures of Pablo and Inigo and so on, and a lot of rejection of that amongst activists in Spain. So we go back to the kind of original point that we're not really ready, we're not receptive to that kind of style of politics. So it's easier for us to effect a mobilization against something by identifying an agent as over and over again, aren't we? Occupy, we are the 99%, the 1%. Experts has been the kind of recent one that, you know, we've got this terrible kind of problem with experts and expertise. Trump and the right wing of the kind of, you know, if we're going to admit that there's right wing populisms of this kind, then Washington, the establishment, Dominic Cummings, you know, lambasting people down in London who don't understand the regions and so on. So politics which is orientated towards injury, towards a sense of hurt, injustice, and which wants to sort of pin the blame on someone, something, some agent. That's really very much extant in our politics. And I think that's an important shift. And we'll come back to that, no doubt, in questions. So I keep hitting buttons, getting no responses. The button I need is down here. So the second one, very familiar to people in this audience, a shift from a sort of agonistic to an antagonistic style of politics. So the left-right spectrum. Again, I've escaped my own presentation here. So when we're thinking about, again, back to the 1960s, 1970s, left-right spectrum, this is the kind of politics that we used to teach to undergraduate students, year 1, year 2, mostly a pendulum moving between the right and the left and back to right again. And that implies itself a kind of, you know, that tick-tock of the pendulum, a structure of expectations, of hopes, if you like, a way of organizing our politics. Two mass parties in many countries, particularly I'm thinking, of course, the UK, Conservatives and Labour, both of which had literally millions of members in the 1960s, 1970s, and we have that gentle switch back and forth with a high degree of consensus, of course. Former colleague of mine, Dennis Kavanagh, harp on about the post-war consensus, the welfare state consensus. This was the sort of substance of our politics really after 1945 until the 1970s, really, until the sort of neoliberal paradigm began to sort of shake the tree of that post-war consensus. But a relatively stable managerial approach to politics in most parts of the world, and disrupted by this kind of politics of think of culpabilization, blaming divides and then dislocates and uncouples. That's not a criticism. That's a description. So I'm not saying it's wrong to sort of want to seek a break from managerialism or managerial approaches, because of course, if your problem is system sort of led, if it's about the system being in legitimation crisis, then of course you're going to say that, well, it's the elites, it's the center left and center right, and they've stitched up the terms of political discourse, and they're all part of that sort of elite problem, and therefore we have to identify the elites as the subject of our political discourse and our organizing. But at the same time, then, I think we have to accept that we're moving onto a kind of territory which Schmidt was interested in, and which Chantal Mouffe picks up obviously later on. We're moving from a kind of friend-friend to a sort of friend-enemy style of discourse here, from a tolerant public discourse to an increasingly antagonistic one. Again, not a criticism, it's much more just about the tenor and nature of political discourse, I think, rather than me saying, well, it would all be much better if we went back to being highly tolerant, pluralist kind of subjects. That's the sort of Jan Werner Müller argument, isn't it? You know, that we're kind of unanchoring ourselves from liberal democratic discourse. I think what I want to say, however, is that I think there is a kind of, you know, I think the left actually loses in this. This is part of my worry about a more antagonistic style of discourse, is that we you know, we're putting petrol on the kind of flames of a sort of divisive public discourse is much more helpful, I think, for, you know, the Trumps, you know, and we'll see this in the US election, won't we, in November, that, you know, he'll be able to say, well, look at all that civil action activity out there, and, you know, it just, well, we can talk about that as well. And it threatens the minimum consensus needed to govern. Proroguing a parliament, rejecting electoral outcomes, threatening media. I think all of this is not that helpful. And I said, well, we can talk about that. It's also a question of tactics and strategy of left and progressive causes. And it's also a question of, you know, does one want to localize that observation? That might work in the US, might work in the UK. I think in more divided societies, or societies where we've got very fundamental cleavages and so on, and Marina obviously will know Greek, and we've got lots of Greek colleagues here, and might say, well, hold on a second, you know, the public discourse is an intolerant one, and we've inherited a kind of different. So I'm open to a conversation about that, but I'm really kind of interested in the describing trend and tendencies mode at the moment, more sociologically driven than normatively driven. The third area, from complexity to radical simplification, as I mentioned in my kind of bouillon of populism, we do think of populism as a kind of a simplifying style of politics. Again, some people want to say that's important for strategic terms, but I think there are, in sociological terms, reasons to be concerned about that. Let's just run ourselves through the bullets, and then you can tell me if I'm sort of losing the plot a bit. Modernization here equating to the complexification of life, increasing specialization, reliance on expertise, bureaucracies of control and management. Of course, we live in a kind of Weberian, post-Weberian world. That's the, you know, basic political sociology that we inherit from Marx and Weber and Michels and the sort of granddaddies and grandmummies of sociological analysis. Is this sense in which we are, you know, modernity equates to complexification. And of course, we've a history there from the mid to late 19th century through the 20th century of elites really embracing complexity and arguing that complexity is a key feature of our political lives. From the ENAC there, the idea that we need to train a special caste of politicians with the insight, almost a kind of Platonic response of making sure that our elites are adequately equipped. The Oxbridge PPE, apologies to anyone who's done ENA or the Oxbridge PPE, this isn't a criticism, these are great courses, but you can see the kind of mentality of saying that, you know, politics is becoming so complex and so demanding of us that we have to have a kind of a justification for a special caste of elites that have the insight, the training, the wisdom to be able to push on our societies in a positive direction. Multi-level governance, briefings, consultations, deliberations, process. The managerial elite, of course, we've inherited from the left, from neo-Marxism, a kind of critique of that as well. Marcuse, Bernheim, C. Wright Mills, these are all figures who in the 50s and 60s kind of criticized managerialism, but they were doing so recognizing that this was the dominant trend and tendency of that particular moment, that our politics was becoming highly complex, highly stratified, specializations of labor, bureaucracies and so on. And they wanted to point out that this had technopolitics, if you like, had its own exclusions. It had its own, you know, it kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. They weren't worried about populism. They worried about that where technologically driven politics, specialized politics was taking us. And of course, this is explored in a lot of dystopian fictions and movies and popular culture of the 60s and 70s, isn't it? I don't know why I was watching a trailer for the old Rollerball movie, 1974 one, probably a sense of nostalgia. But those of you who've seen Rollerball, the original one, will know that it kind of plays on that. It's 1974, it's Norman Jewison and James Caan. The key thing is that our politics has become so managerial, so corporatist, that it's become removed from the lives of ordinary people. It's kind of, you know, it's washed over politics. And that was the great fear of those critics like Marcuse and Mills, is that we would actually lose politics altogether. It would simply become an arm of sort of well, as Mills says, a military-industrial complex, picking up from Eisenhower's comment in the 1950s there. So the return of the political, the MOOF moment there, the kind of populism shaking the tree, if you like, reminding us of a kind of unruly, excessive public, is a kind of an important corrective. And reminding us that the kind of managerialism was a kind of an elitist style of politics, but it's also one incapable of resolving hurt. And as a result of that, we've got now the rise of outsiders with simpler slogans and formulae to address injustice. And of course, nothing simpler than make America great again. And also with simplistic policy demands, get Brexit done. So these are, you know, I think populist slogans. This is what populism means for a large part of the kind of commentariat, if you like. We can be critical of that. But the idea of politics as being condensing and as being effective and being, you know, trying to tug on the heartstrings of the populace, of course, is something that I think is common to our understanding of populism, but it's one that I think comes with a cost. Anti-expertise, anti-deliberative, anti-consultation, gestural performative politics, permanent campaigning mode. So Alan Finlayson and others have written recently about the tendency of the current Johnson regime is that really it's kind of, you know, it's not really governing. It's sloganeering, it's simplifying. It's really its main mandate, its main consideration is to maintain a grip on power. And when we allow politicians to enter into that populist mode, then what happens is that we kind of expunge and we deny the complexity and reality of politics. So we start to blur the distinction between governing and electioneering. We start to just have electioneering and campaigning, and we don't again we kind of run full circle. There's a denial of politics and a denial of complexity. So last point here is really about the kind of direction of travel in our politics more broadly. Those of you who know your sort of political science literatures will know that kind of concept of presidentialization really came to fruition sort of 1990s in response to the collapsing narrative and practice of collective and cabinet governance, as we've seen across the Western democracies, already giving way to presidentialization, and therefore to sort of the cult of personality, rise of non-specialists, outsiders, celebrities, and celebrities becoming politicians and politicians becoming celebrities. So moving towards what the Situationists, very presciently, if you haven't read your Van Eyck and Guy Debord's and Baudrillard's from the 1970s, what they call spectacular politics, politics of crisis, histrionics, drama, antagonism, popularization of politics, spectacularization. Power less as a means to an end than an end to the support of a leadership clique. So again, a provocation for you all. Are we thinking about really politics as having lost this ideological component, the component which insists on promise of a better world, promise of a new vision, promise of things that we can deliver on, in favor of a kind of just a spectacular televisual hyper-mediatized politics with a disdain for process, institutions, deliberation, and accountability? So those are 4 trends and tendencies, nearly the end, last 3-4 minutes. And I'm going to kind of get through this, in 3-4 minutes. So we'll there's a bit of stuff to talk about. But the drivers, of course, if you're talking about trends and tendencies, people are interested in, well, what are the drivers here? You know very well the recent literature's about what people think is driving populism. I'm not a great, those of you who've read my little text, and if you haven't, $9.99 in all good bookshops. No, it's even cheaper than that. Or just write me a nice email saying, Simon, we loved your, and I'll try and send you one out. Material, do we think economic change is a key here? And if so, how? Acceleration since 2008, that phrase, Mark Bly's phrase, global Trumpism. I don't think material factors are all that important here, largely because, as you can hear, I'm thinking about popularization as something which is going much more further back into trends and tendencies, really, from the kind of post-war onwards. Therefore I'm not really thinking about shocks and crises, either the 1974 oil crisis or the 2008 global financial crisis. Of course, these precipitate certain kinds of response, anti-austerity politics and so on, but the trends and tendencies I'm interested in are a little bit more deeper line there. Cultural, of course, everyone knows Pippa Norris's stuff, David Goodhart, The Road to Somewhere and so on. We're becoming more authoritarian, less tolerant, nativist, etc. Well, is my response. I mean, I think it applies much more readily, obviously, to, if we're thinking that populism equates to right-wing nativist politics, and many of us don't, and I heard that in the last session as well, then of course there's a certain stickiness to that. But I don't buy that, and I don't think that that kind of values capture exercise that Pippa is so good at really gets to the root of what I'm talking about. Political, of course, I've written quite extensively about that. The decline of trust, authority structures, group identifications, and so on. These things are well documented in the literatures. You want to have a read of that, about that. In my point of view, chapter 2 of End of Representative Politics, I sort of give an overview of that. We can talk about the decline of liberal democratic politics, really, the kind of classic paradigm since the 60s. Media ecology is the one that I'm really interested in getting your sort of feedback on. And I really do think that changing media ecologies is an important driver. Not necessarily the only one, it's a multifactorial issue, but I keep coming back to changes in the media landscape and how the media is thought about. So I'd love to spend more time on this slide, but I don't want to abuse my host's generosity. So I might just stick it up there later on. But I'm thinking about, again, the last half century or so is my kind of point of reference for these trends and tendencies. And I'm thinking that, Althusser writing in the 1960s about the media being the kind of part of the ideological state apparatus, a near monopoly of knowledge exercised by elites, dissemination of knowledge underpinning authority structures, costly and complex to challenge those dominant narratives. So, when I was growing up, we had 3 TV channels. There was no internet. It was very difficult to come upon alternative frameworks for understanding the world, right? You just watched the BBC, you bought the big, the Times or the broadsheet. And of course, that's not to say that there wasn't Samizdat and pamphlets and so on. It's just much harder to be aware of those things than it is where the trends are now towards this kind of crazy dissemination. And again, I put media 1, media 2, we moved towards the evolution of popular media. So I'm thinking here things like Profumo, 1964, the scandal that then sort of took the lid off the nature of the governing class in the UK, and that provoked a real kind of backlash. And it also promoted a kind of lust, a desire to hear more. Daily Mirror, The Sun, all these kind of the tabloidification of news became a real sort of thing at that point, as people demonstrated a greater desire to want to hear more about the underside and the grotesque side of politics than necessarily kind of reading pages of parliamentary reports. And then, of course, we move on to the era of the internet, opening up new channels, indie media, of course, much more easier to circulate alternative visions of the world, proliferation of sources, Web 2 and so on, and on to more like the contemporary social media landscape with its echo chambers, ease of circulation of conspiracy theories, counter-narratives, critical memes, Twitterification of political discourse. Do we not think that this is having an impact on our political lives, how we interact and think about politics? And of course, the dominance, I'm reminded of this really, A lot of really good papers on this dominance of visual over lexic representation. The picture, the visual, very, very important now for our thinking, or for our framing and thinking and responding to the political. So those people, Ben Moffitt's doing a terrific new project on populism and visual representation. I think that's a great, I didn't get him to do that, by the way, but I think that kind of thing, the visual, so important, isn't it? Okay, last slide, and then we'll kind of, because the last slide is also just, where do you go with these kind of observations? And I'm very much open to comment, criticism, debate, and so on. So politics, my politics is popularizing and popularized. A very ungainly way of putting it, but that's my fudge for brain kind of way of putting things at the moment. Underpinned by changes in media ecology, in turn creating fragile, anxious subjects. And it's a loop, isn't it? Those fragile, anxious subjects are in turn maintaining, propping up, wanting a particular kind of engagement with the political. Emmy's got there before me about anxious and anxiety subjects, and her book is actually on my desk. You won't believe that, Emmy, but it's there to be read when I get more than 3 minutes, obviously, but I'd love to sort of have an exchange about that. Are these trends, tendencies reversible? Wow, ooh, you tell me. Are they global, limited in time and space to certain democracies, but not others, or only to democracies and not authoritarian regimes, China, etc.? How should progressives respond? Do we go with the flow, left populism, so we embrace populism and some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of simplifying effective politics and so on, effective strategies, or do we resist the flow? There's a real debate in places like Spain. There are lots of counter arguments and narratives. And if so, how? If you're resisting the flow, what a left populist wants to hear is how you do it. So if these are the trends and tendencies, but you don't like them, what is your strategy? And that's why I end with the last bullet is, do we need a new theory of the avant-garde? I mean, it's a very strange kind of thing to end with, but a lot of these kind of questions were the kinds of questions which people like Baudrillard and Foucault and Deleuze were asking in the 1970s. And the interesting thing for me is, where do you go now for a kind of theory of the avant-garde in a kind of hyper-mediatized environment? I suspect that if Mackenzie Walk was here, she would have, a lot of things to say about that. But unfortunately, she's not here. I might have to just, look her up on Facebook and say, what do you think? So I'm going to stop there, slightly over time. Apologies for that. But I hope there's something there for us to get our teeth into. Thanks for being a patient audience.
Thank you so much, Simon. That was absolutely excellent. Very many thoughts that we can discuss, I believe. So if we are now opening the floor up to questions, and if you could please indicate in the chat if you would like to ask the question, and then I will take your name down. And Simon, if it's okay with you, if we could take around 3 questions at a time.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And then you can answer them.
Yeah.
And obviously, if people have sort of counterpoints,
yes,
etc., then I will try to account for that as well. So I can see that the first question is from Maria. So please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the great thought-provoking presentation. And what this is really a question, and which I think many of us are struggling with, and is this so? Because you use this structure of, this is the politics that we have now, and this was roughly the politics that we had in what might call the post-war consensus. Now, my question is, was the post-war consensus sort of the norm, or was the post-war consensus sort of the exception that has to do with a very specific historical point in time in which there were structural sociological elements that constrained politics in a very particular way that it's very difficult and not impossible to replicate? Because politics, democratic politics before the post-war consensus was very different, and in some ways more similar to the politics that we have today. And of course, we know that there are parts of the world in which this post-war consensus never really coalesced. And we were, Latin America, and the semi-periphery, and people told us, no, you have to keep moving, and you reach this political modernization stage. So I guess the question is, should we take that moment as the norm and something that was lost? Or should we say, this was a very particular point of time, that it's not really replicable, so how do we move from then on? Thank you.
Thanks for that. Brilliant.
Okay, thanks, Maria. Jorgos, I think you have a question as well.
Yeah. So, Simon, thank you for the great presentation. It was an excellent keynote, very engaging, as always. But there were...
I knew there was going to be a but, Georgios.
What?
I knew there was going to be a but.
Yeah, always.
Always, good.
I really like the idea of populism as a bouillon. I'm pronouncing it correctly, the populist bouillon that you presented to us. But there are certain things that I'm not absolutely clear about. So I really like the kind of zooming out to a way to really see, to develop a kind of long-term narrative, historical, sociological, about certain transformations in the way that politics work, in the way that representation works, the way that the public sphere works, and so on and so forth. But I confess that I struggled a bit at certain points to understand how you differentiate between certain pathologies already within the system, and whether you actually see populism as a pathology or maybe a remedy to certain problems that we see in the way that political systems work and the way that representation works or does not work. And of course, you deal with such issues in your little new book, which I find brilliant, especially the last bit about democracy. But I got a sense during that keynote, so someone that hasn't read that book might have gotten the idea that you leaned more towards understanding populism as a pathology. And please correct me if I'm wrong, and I understand that you have to be very brief and very selective in terms of what you're going to convey through this keynote. But what I was missing was, what if there are already certain pathologies within the system, within the way that political systems develop, to which populism is not part of the problem, but could be part of the solution. Part of the remedy, and something that is already inherent in any politics that entails democratic representation and so on and so forth. So this is the general comment / question. And there are certain bits again. So when you discussed the kind of anti-expertise, anti-deliberation elements within populism, whether you were presenting this as part of how we discuss, how we understand populism, or whether this is actually your position, because I could offer several examples where this is actually not the case. So this wouldn't be, for example, bits of my understanding of the core of populism. They are quite often there, but I wouldn't understand them as the core. And final bit, I promise, and I'm going to make it brief: complexity versus simplicity. And I'm wondering here about the connection between the logics of difference and the logic of equivalence in Laclau, and the broader question that we always deal with, whether one is better than the other. I don't think so. I think they always coexist, as difference always coexists with equivalence in different amounts. I think that also simplicity and complexity are always part of politics, and that without simplicity, certain struggles, for example, could never advance. Not just populist struggles, any kind of struggle, democratic struggles, struggles for inclusion, for emancipation, if they do not simplify the social field, they cannot create broader fronts. So again, I could see where you were going with that, but in the keynote, talking specifically about what you have presented today, I wasn't sure about whether there is a kind of normative element in the way that we understand complexity versus simplicity. Okay, that's all. I hope it was clear. Thank you again.
Very clear. Thank you, Gorgas. Yeah.
Okay, Andy, I think you got a question too.
Yeah, Simon, that was brilliant. There's no but from me at all. It was, I'm going to follow up. I mean, Georgios's contribution was great as well.
Yeah.
I suppose here's a kind of minor question, really. Why are you calling it sociology rather than history? And Georgios kind of hinted at that, because I think that's what you've just provided for us. And it might be because I'm not familiar enough with the genre of political sociology, and you're really good at I suppose classifying different forms of political studies into their right boxes, as they were. And here, I think that there is something kind of underlying what you're saying that's kind of motivating it, and it's what's motivating, I would imagine, most of us. What do you, how would you position the history of the left currently?
That's a small and easy question. So Simon, do you want to have a go at?
Okay, epic questions. I mean, to be honest, this is actually what I was hoping for. I really like difficult things to try and chew on. But as we all know, it's much better done either with very good coffee in front of you or a lovely glass of Shiraz or something like that. And unfortunately, we can't do that, but we will do when normality resumes. Which brings me to the first question about normality and about whether, and I think the subtext here, if I'm not mistaken, is about, again, it's about the left and about progressive politics and about whether I am being or am I encouraging a sort of nostalgia towards the post-war consensus. I don't think I am, and I wouldn't want to do that, although I am myself a creature of that consensus, coming from a council flat at the back of King's Cross Station in pretty unfavorable circumstances and being able to take advantage of free education, free university. I'm actually not nostalgic about it, but I'm very aware that particularly under current conditions, give me a choice between post-war consensus and Boris Johnson and Trump and all the rest of it. I would. So I'm a bit like kind of Zizek on that. It's a sort of probably the task of the left at the moment is to defend the post-war consensus. Yeah, free education, free healthcare, a sense of community. But it also had its downsides. It was managerial. There wasn't enough input from citizens. Often things were produced for people without a great deal of understanding or invitation to participate in that kind of sausage making exercise. As long as we liked the sausage, we didn't ask much about how it's being made, kind of thing. So I think we can embrace and think about the post-war, that the welfare state as being something which is very important. I mean, I'm basically a social democrat at heart, as you can probably tell. So I have this terrible anxious swings from center left to slightly more radical left and this kind of thing. But concretely, I think it's over. Therefore, the task has to be in terms of where are we now in terms of our geopolitics, in terms of our positioning in the globe, and in terms of what movements and what forms of resistance are extant out there to defend the kind of basic values that anyone on the left espouses. So we can't recover the post-war consensus, unfortunately, just to kind of reiterate that. Georgios, of course. And you're not going to be satisfied with my answer, I don't think, because I do believe in different genres, and I do believe that life is quite complicated. And I don't want to be glib here. I'm just kind of thinking on the hoof about what we're doing at different moments in time. So there are moments when you want to be writing and thinking in a kind of sociological mode. There are moments where you're thinking you want to intervene in a particular set of debates. There are moments when you want to be very kind of political sciencey about things and put things in cases. And that's why, to me, a bouillon, baggy, not terribly analytically well-framed approach, I'm kind of comfortable with that. But I can see why people are not, because they want neat round pegs that go in round holes, and I'm just kind of fairly comfortable with lumpy, bumpy things. Having said that, your question deserves a little bit more than that, because I think what you do pinpoint is, at what point can you just switch off the normative and go into the sociological, and what point can you just switch off the sociological and become normative? To me, the part of the problem is that I think that I tend to think that left populism, is a very concrete thing. It's a very strategic thing. And so therefore, for me, it's something which you can choose or not to choose at a particular juncture. I'm not philosophically wedded or apodictically wedded to left populism. On the other hand, there came a moment in the evolution of 15M, for example, in the Spanish situation, where you just want to go be populist. I mean, Ada Colau, one of the world's kind of incredible horizontal activists. And there's a moment in the movie about Ada Colau where people said, we need to be basically populist. We need you as a brand. You need to be out there because people identify with and individuals and your values, and you're well known. And we're going to have to do that in order to win. I just like, yes, you've got to be, to me, yes, there's a kind of moment there where you just have to sort of concretely say, this is the best strategy at this particular juncture. Left populism in the UK today, where is your figure? Where is your, how would it work? What are the kind of ways in which, you can begin to assemble a form of resistance which might win? Is that a left populist strategy or not? I mean, boy, Marina is there. I get heckles. To me, it's very concrete, these kind of questions, rather than sociological. So I can switch genre, and I can sit in a pub and talk. If somebody says, well, what's the best move for the left at the moment in the UK in 2020? It might be different to what is the best move for what's happening in Spain, or what's the best happening in Greece. So I'm quite sort of, how can one put it? I'm sort of biddable on strategies, rather than seeing strategy as something which, in a sense, and being a scholar of kind of Soviet politics, my first part of my career, I mean, people tend to think of Lenin, for example, as a very dogmatic, orthodox, cranky politician. One of the things you learn, and if you haven't read it, Neil Harding's book, My Supervisor on Lenin's Political Thought, incredibly pragmatic all the way through 1917. What's the best way of using this particular moment in time? Is it to facilitate and to encourage the Soviets and the sense of autonomy and self-empowerment, or is there now a moment where only the injunction to follow? But we will have a long conversation about that, and we must. Pathology or remedy? I don't know. People might have come across my paper on populism as a pharmacon. If you haven't, you might want to look that up, or just email me and I'll send it out. I'm playing with that idea there. So is it a toxin which could produce a benefit? And it's a bit like the cancer cure thing. So you take something which is really harsh to the body, but it cures you, kind of thing. Should we be thinking about populism in terms of an intervention of that kind, where in a sense there has to be a sort of condensation, a moment where, as Lenin, in 1917, where you just have to set aside the horizontality and the energy of the kind of, mass participatory model, and just say, for this particular purpose of this particular junk, I'm open to that. But it's, again, very concrete, very strategic. The task I set for myself today was to be quite sociological and not to be very political. And you're looking for political. That's not an apology. That's just a different genre. So that might not be. And I love the point about Laclau difference and equivalence mapping onto complexity and simplicity. I need to think about that. I'm not going to try to, because I think it's so important, and many of you will be thinking a similar to a thought to that, and whether, in a sense, we can still use a Laclauian frame to be thinking about this simplicity complexity issue. I kind of agree. I need to think about that. Andy, on history and sociology, I think I'm interested in not only where we've come from, but where we're going and what the opportunities are. And I think that turns you from being a historian into a more sociologically driven kind of analysis, even though my normative recommendations are, as the last slide indicates, of a very kind of hesitant kind. I think the left is a little bit in disarray at the moment, actually, and not just in the UK. I just think that, you know, even with COVID, I mean, what is the proper left response to COVID? Is it more, better state intervention, or should we be defending civil liberties and people's rights to do what? I mean, I think I just haven't read a really compelling kind of left progressive account of what, you know, so I think we're kind of in a little bit of abeyance. And that's of course part of the fact that when we use that term, the left, what we're trying to describe is a multiplicity of things, some of whom are, you know, and people, some of whom are very wedded to a particular way in thinking about what that means, and others who've just got a set of values that they share. And I love the stuff about the Gilets jaunes, because I think the Gilets jaunes is trying to, you know, maintain that sense of inclusivity whilst also having a narrative about what it's angry about and what it's against. But that's proving quite difficult in the French context, because of course the party system, you know, you've got Mélenchon saying, well, I can help you. And then you've got the center left saying, I can help you. And you've got, you know, further left groups, Besançon, I can help. Where does it stand? It wants to remain outside of that kind of reductive strategy. So what should the left be doing? I just think the left should really be busy resisting these figures and just kind of rallying behind anything which looks like a promising antidote to Trump and to Johnson and to Le Pen. And I think if you think about France in a year and a half's time, we're going to be right in that space again. You know, how do we just keep those horrible forces of, you know, reductive nativist simplicity at bay? Difficult. Sorry, we've got lots of questions and I'm hogging the microphone as usual. Emmy.
Okay, Alan, I think you had a question as well.
Yeah, so I just want to, thank you, Simon. I just want to draw upon what I think Jorgos was hinting at. For example, you were talking about the blurring of the distinction between governing and electioneering.
Yeah.
You can currently see with the Johnson government. And I would just like to point that we've seen this blurring already before. Especially, like you mentioned, these more structural processes happening in Western European politics with the professionalization of politics, of politicians, and those in government being more concerned with what public opinion surveys are saying, and this focus groups, and what sort of results they get from these political consultants. And we've seen this under Tony Blair government, under David Cameron. So I wouldn't say that this is really a trait of populists per se. Second, material factors. I mean, this is very dear to my heart because I work in international political economy, and I would just say that yes, material factors on their own, they don't cause populism, they can explain populism, but how political actors respond to these material factors and economic consequences, this is what is then, I would say, the cause of populism or shapes populism. So with what sort of policy responses or political responses do they respond, let's say, to an economic crisis? So I wouldn't just say that they're not relevant. And then in terms of left populism, for example, you mentioned the US current election context. For example, I see the influence of left populism, for example, by Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez or Bernie Sanders pushing Biden to adopt, let's say, a Green New Deal agenda if he is elected. So I still see, and maybe he would adopt some of the, let's say, left populist policies. So this is where I still see space for left populism in the US, even though Bernie Sanders didn't get the nomination. Or, for example, to respond to the COVID crisis, I mean, you're right, there's many little policy proposals that are circling around on universal basic income, on debt monetization or helicopter money from central banks, on shortening the working time. But you're right, there hasn't been a left populist political actor who would bring all these together and present them as a coherent alternative. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alan. Okay. Good points, yeah.
Thanks. Jenna, you had a question as well?
Yeah, hi Simon, really interesting keynote, thank you. My question was just about, so when we talk about the need for crisis or the way that populism and crisis interact, but then also when we're talking about populism as simplicity, thinking about COVID and the fact that this is an ongoing, potentially indefinite crisis, and yes, my co-writer has just woken up. How do you think that will play out for populists in terms of being able to manage this supposed distrust of experts and need to simplify things, but at the same time, how do you navigate a pandemic while also balancing that, if that makes sense.
Okay, thanks, Jenna. I'm going to ask a really quick question as well as the chair, because there are no other people in the chat that have indicated. So thanks, Simon. I really like what you said about populism as a sort of potential natural product of European modernity. But I'm wondering if this statement means that the fault lines will have to be drawn differently than what we normally do. Because in my view, there is this, we can make this sort of rejection of representation our sort of central focus, where you have the sort of social movements that reject representation, and then you have populists that reject a certain idea of representation, and then you have mainstream politics that want representation to look in a certain way that it has for the past few decades. But I find that is that really the case? Because what I find is, like, if we try to put the sort of social movements and populists in the same basket, as they are sort of repoliticizing the political climate, but in fact, isn't it also the case that populists, in a sense, are much more similar to the mainstream in terms of representation? And when we say that there is this rejection of process, a rejection of expertise, and a rejection of technocracy, etc., I agree with Giorgos that there are many instances where this is not the case with populists, and that actually it's only the disdain for process is not as strong with populists as it would be with many social movements, and so the fault line doesn't really sort of stand between populists, social movements on the one hand, and mainstream politics on the other. So I really wonder whether populists aren't perhaps more similar to the European mainstream and to the European idea of representation, of sovereignty, and of accepting many things that we are currently living in to a much higher degree, and that maybe they aren't just the remedy for democracy after all because of this.
Good stuff. Okay, so I've got three. Let's see what we can say. So on Alan's point about materiality, I don't think we're going to disagree there. I think what I want to say, and kind of conscious I got very hurried towards the end there, is that I don't think we can reduce the rise of populism to material factors. But of course, material factors are incredibly important, as you say, in terms of thinking about what the political options are, and the rise of populism in any particular always has a kind of material base. I mean, I'm enough of a sort of materialist to go with you on that one. It's just that I think there's been a tendency to say, and it might be just in the popular press, and that's one of the kind of stresses that we have in these kind of debates, isn't it? Is that we have a kind of, left populists don't agree with what the rest of the commentariat describes populism as being. Out there, if you like, in the sort of commentariat world, populism is something that arose in response to, very largely in response to the 2008 global financial crisis. And I think my point is, I don't think that's very good chronology. And yes, we had movements and so on and responses, as you would describe it, Alan, but I don't think that the trends and tendencies that I would want to ascribe to populist politics have their origin at that particular juncture. So that's the point. I don't think we've got a kind of serious disagreement there. Left populism, and that's a good point. I mean, I think that's definitely worth restating, that in a sense, part of kind of the left populism repertoire is not necessarily to capture power, but also to influence those people who are capable of capturing power. So, and I think that's a really good way of thinking about the impact of Saunders and AOC in the kind of US context. Is it was kind of unlikely that Saunders was going to get, but of course there's been a big upsurge in terms of the kind of demands that we associate with Saunders and Ocasio-Cortez in terms of democratic politics, and Biden has had to, of course, doff his cap in reaction to that. Whether there's enough kind of impetus there to sort of carry him through to a victory, and then with victory to actually do anything with that stuff, you know, we'll wait and see. But I think it is a good reminder that, in a sense, those with more radical demands and agendas are operating not just outside party politics or in their own parties, but also within, where we've got two-party systems. Of course, you've got more radical leftist demands that then kind of drive forward a particular political agenda. So that's a very useful reminder for me. Jenna, I mean, I think on COVID, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? I mean, I think I don't know if anyone's done it yet, but if they haven't done it, I'm sure that we're going to get those kind of analyses about mapping, just taking the European context, mapping the variety of West European contexts from, you know, Sweden down one end all the way through the Nordic responses, Germany, France, onto the kind of, you know, the politics, however mapped and however we want to do it, and whether we find any kind of correlations there between the sort of the ability of those who have a stronger attachment to the post-war welfare state managing this crisis better than those who have adopted a more neoliberalized or privatized or more sort of chaotic style of governance that we associate with a sort of free market. So you know, there'll be those kind of analyses, and Yorgos might say, well, that was the point of the populism and COVID exercise that some of us have contributed to, but I haven't read, because I haven't done any reading, I haven't read the other responses, but I think that's a very interesting way of, you know, is the old Pope, you know, are we going to see a sort of a reigniting of the demand for some of that sort of managerial, sensible, expert-driven, deliberative, consultative approach in response to the inability of some regimes, Johnson's in particular comes to mind here, to, you know, that's a kind of an interesting thing. And that leads directly, I think, segues to Emmy's point about whether the left populists are the kind of the good Democrats, the good sort of liberal Democrats kind of thing. I mean, that's an interesting provocation. But I think you know, the wider politics of that comment is about what we mean by populism. So we kind of end where we started, and where a lot of the sessions, I imagine, certainly this morning's session, was really about, you know, what is essential and what we agree to be absolute. So apologies for background noises here. That I'm getting ready for lunch. Could you just? Sorry, I can hardly hear myself think. And it comes back to what it is that left populism is really trying to do, and what it is that is core to those demands. And I do think that core to many of those, the impetus of whether it be Syriza or 15M or Corbyn, if we're going to allow him a sort of populist moment and so on, is not nostalgia for a welfare state, but it is a kind of demand for a repoliticization and a bringing back into the public sphere those things which in a free market context seem to have been outsourced and sold off and privatized and become part of some much more general reaction against the idea of a kind of, you know, of the state, and of the state as being a provider as well as the guarantor of certain basic minimums. So if that is what left populism is, then and if its kind of goal is really to sort of restore those values, that way of thinking about the relationship between the people and the sovereign state, then, you know, who knows, Rishi Sunak might be, you know, a very important stimulus to a kind of left populist renaissance on that front, because I think that's the interesting thing, isn't it, in the UK at the moment, is that the ultra, you know, statist response to furloughing and so on, and universal basic income, as I think Alan put it, is very much in that kind of philosophical dimension there. So we might find that some of the parameters of our own thinking about what left and right means and what status and anti-status means are going to be. So that goes back to Jenna's point, doesn't it? What are the longer term ramifications of COVID? It might well be that some of the coordinates that I'm using, that we're all using in terms of how we frame these things, become disrupted, particularly if it goes on, and particularly if we need more from the state in order to prevent us from sort of descending into a kind of, you know, a barbaric austerity. That's not a very cheerful thought to end with, but yeah, I think I'll stop on that.
Right. Simon, are you pressed for time? Do you need to leave?
I could do any one or two more issues if anybody wants.
Okay, because we just had a couple of more questions.
Yeah.
If people could just be as brief as possible, that would be lovely.
Yeah.
So I think we have Callum and Atina. So Callum, if you want to go first, please.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
That's all, so I'm probably brilliant. Thanks a lot for the talk. Yeah, I'll try and keep it brief. You talk about sociology, obviously, and you mentioned some sociologists that might be useful. In my work, I draw on Bourdieu, and kind of yourself and Benjamin Moffat have kind of linked to this with the cultural low and stuff. And I was wondering how important you think cultural forms of appeals are now. For example, we have the rise of social media, you have Twitter, Instagram. You're always trying to look like the people. So it might be Donald Trump eating his McDonald's or Nigel Farage drinking his beer. I'm just wondering, how important you think Bourdieu is, or if he plays a role in helping us understand the culture that so often ties itself with populists.
Yeah,
Thanks.
good point. Yeah.
Okay, Atina, if you want to ask your question as well, really brief. Thanks.
Okay, hi. I hope you can hear me well. I'm actually back at my office after very many months, so it's an interesting.
How are you doing?
I'm very good. How are you, Simon?
Brilliant to see you.
You too. Yes, looking good. So my question really. So I'm looking at the Extinction Rebellion right now, and I'm hoping to actually even do actual fieldwork interviews. But while I've been looking at this, there is, I don't know how much you are aware of this, but there was a magical moment with Extinction Rebellion at some point in April 2019. And then there was an interesting point where the XR youth, Extinction Rebellion youth, actually barged into one of their meetings when they were discussing what they're going to do an action at Heathrow. And demanded to be heard, and because they wanted to stop that action, but broadly that they weren't feeling part of the movement. And then at some point, the central figure, Roger Hallam, leaves and does the action in Heathrow, doesn't go well. Now we have a new action recently with the Murdoch press that was criticized about, and this tension that you alluded to between, is this about rights and so on, or is it about something else? So I think there is also, with Extinction Rebellion in particular, that they managed to capture the imagination because the climate change issue and was one that a lot of people could tap into, right? And of course they were criticized not for being very global north and white middle class, that the people were afforded to be arrested, the tactic of being arrested all the time, it didn't take into account of racist bias and all this kind of stuff. I'm wondering, because there's this tension, is how open do you leave the ideological framing of a movement to be, for a lot of the people to be able to identify and tap into, and how then close do you have to take it for it to have an actual strategy? So it's the classical identity strategy problem, but it is relevant to what you're discussing in where is the COVID actually taking us, because you can see Extinction Rebellion actually would have to a lot to contribute to this discussion, and actually a lot of people identify what they're trying to do, especially because of COVID being a symptom of, capitalism and whatever, and they've been criticized of not challenging enough capitalism and so on. But generally speaking, there have been successful recent moments again of Extinction Rebellion, and they had many people joining the movement, and actually the fact that you had such big boost to the movement caused problems of where it was going to go as well. And then COVID came and kind of like stopped, but now they started again. And I'm wondering, in this identity and strategy kind of tension in movements that relates to, could it relate also to whether it's how populist they are, and this kind of story? And the second one, because you talk about temporality, and when Yannis Stavrakakis came here, I asked him about the role of time in populism, because whether you have sort of more conservatives doing time in the past, or time specialization of time in the future, the more utopian left. And I'm thinking now of French theory in relation to time. Yanis told me that populism as scholarship did not examine the role of time. So when I saw your talk, I was thinking this is fantastic because Simon might be doing some of that. So these are the two things very quickly, and I will stop here so I can hear what you have to say.
Yeah, great stuff. And of course, you're very welcomed here to Bristol, Athena, which is
I know, yes.
Extinction
I
Rebellion.
must come and visit you for sure.
Of course,
yes.
she must.
It's in my plans.
Good. You'll be very welcome. Callum, well, I think we're kind of, you and I, on the side of the angels here. Culture very much uppermost in my way of thinking about these things. And Bourdieu, of course, as being a major theorist of culture, I'd be very supportive of anyone who's trying to mobilize a kind of Bourdieuian analysis of contemporary politics. So if you've got something that you'd like to show me that you've written, then I'd be very happy to engage with that. But more generally, you know, as I said, I think media and media ecology, media strategies are very, very important for us. And I'm conscious that I didn't even notice Athena was here, and she's such a sort of a key figure for helping us thinking about, you know, what this means, and not only in terms of sociologically, but also in terms of political strategies as well. So Bourdieu, yes. Culture, yes. The media, very, very important. And please do send me something. On Athena's point, I mean, I'm enough of a Leclercian and people who've read my little bit on populism, the populism book that Gorgos was so complimentary about, will know that I very kind of Leclercian on this. I mean, I think the more Extinction Rebellion worries about appeals to the people and what it is that the people want and the people need, the less attractive they're going to become. I think they need to have a hegemonic strategy. My critique, if anything, of XR, and I don't, you know, there are people here who will be activists and so on, is that when you look at the kind of series of demands in the program, it seems, I won't say feeble, but it seems like it's a very minimum specification which is designed to keep alive that sort of inclusivity kind of thing. And I think there is space in British politics for a more pungent program, a manifesto, and something which really does connect the dots between the economy, politics, society, deliberation, democracy, because I think Labour, and again, apologies to anyone here, Labour activists, I was thrown out in '84, so I don't have to apologise, but I don't think under Keir Starmer we're going to see a imaginative, creative, hegemonic project evolving. I think we're going to see a very crabby, centrist politics, very sensible, nice haircuts and so on, to try to appease the Daily Telegraph and Daily Mail readers. So I do think there is space on the left there for Extinction Rebellion, should it so choose, to be what we see emerging in Europe, actually, that kind of green-red, the sort of what they call watermelon politics, where we ally some, you know, the green impetus, the climate change impetus, with a left socialist kind of agenda, because I don't see anyone else doing that. And I think Extinction Rebellion has got the energy, it's got the impetus. Many young people, all our students are quite sympathetic and so on. They've got a great media strategy. And of course, before COVID, they really did have an ability to get in the faces of the British public. The problem with, of course, is that COVID has kind of sidetracked all of that. And meant that we've got to put a pause on politics whilst we're trying to scramble our way back to something remotely looking like normality. But if the subtext of your question is there a space there for a kind of green left grouping with imaginative media strategies to really make some advances in Britain and probably elsewhere in Europe, as we've seen in France, the recent regional elections, and in Germany, the recent elections there, I'd agree, yes. I think that's really very, very important for us at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Simon, for being patient with us and all of our questions.
No, lots of fun. Thank you very much, everyone. Brilliant, brilliant questions. And really just a big pity that we can't all be together, isn't it? Because you can carry on and have those conversations. But if anyone wants to go offline, drop me an email, send me something. Delighted to do so. And really looking forward to getting kind of back into the physical conference beat next year.
We will look forward to it as well. We can't wait to meet people in person. And thank you so much for this talk and for everyone's question. It's really great. We are reconvening again tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. And we hope to see many of you there. So thank you so much.
Thank you again.